Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the week's top political stories. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. We're here to give you the facts so you can form your own opinion. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for being with us. Today, we'll be introducing you to Ballotpedia's legislation tracking tool, going over the election results from the June 28th primaries, and catching you up on the latest redistricting news. Welcome to On the Ballot. State election laws are constantly changing or evolving, and keeping track of the latest developments can seem like a daunting task, even for the election experts here at Ballotpedia. That's why we created our Election Administration Legislation Tracker, an extensive database that makes Ballotpedia's comprehensive political coverage more accessible than ever. Here to discuss this exciting new tool is Editor-in-Chief Jeff Palais.
Hey, Victoria.
And Marquee Staff Writer Jarek Adams.
Glad to be here.
So to start, can one of you explain how this project developed?
Yeah, so I'm really excited to talk about it. It's a brand new product. We saw the complexities of the rules around elections really take off after the 2020 election cycle. Our team, led by Jarek, spent a great deal of time trying to keep up with all of the changing rules and dates and regulations around how to conduct elections. And so we knew that, in the States, this would be a really big topic coming out of all of that. So here at Ballotpedia, we like to say context, context, context. And what better way to provide context than with election legislation tracking? Whether you have 5 minutes for research or want to go deep on election legislation in your state, there's nothing as comprehensive as our election legislation tracker. A simple, powerful, accurate, unbiased, and free platform. We designed the Election Administration Tracker to be state-of-the-art. The tracker's advanced features help make the information people are looking for as accessible as possible and include our latest free weekly digest reporting on all of the updates, which I'm particularly excited about.
How do readers find this new tool?
Yeah, so you find that from going to legislation.ballotpedia.org, which is our brand new site that we just launched, or you can come to the regular ballotpedia.org and you'll find your way over there.
And Jarek, how can they use it, or how do we use it?
The search functionality within our tracker database is extremely robust. So if a user goes to legislation.ballotpedia.org and goes to the search page, they will see 8 different search bars, basically, by which they can filter the bills to look for things that are of interest to them. They can look for bills by bill number, for instance. If they've read in their newspaper about a bill that's moving through their state legislature, they can look up that bill specifically. They can also isolate bills by those that have been acted upon recently. If somebody's interested, for instance, in seeing only those bills that have seen some legislative action within the past 2 weeks, they can use a calendar function within the search to isolate those bills. Obviously, we enable users to search by state. If a user is interested in legislation from one particular state, they can search that. If they're interested in legislation from multiple states, they can search that as well. And of course, you can search for all states at the same time. We have also enabled readers to search by bill status. So if a reader is interested in only seeing those bills that have been enacted into law, a reader can very easily do that. Finally, and probably most importantly, we enable readers to search by topic. We've developed a really robust system for tagging bills by their topic. We've devised 22 what we call parent categories that deal with broad-based areas of election policy. That might be something like absentee mail-in voting, for instance. Aside from those, or in addition to those 22 parent categories, we've introduced 88 more specific tags to describe the specific contents of a bill. So, for instance, if a bill deals with absentee mail-in voting, it might deal with eligibility, it might deal with requirements for returning ballots, it might deal with the requirements for requesting a ballot in the first place. If a reader is interested only in those bills that deal with the request process for absentee ballots, the reader can very easily search for that. We can also search for bills by partisan sponsorship. If you are only interested in bills that were sponsored by Democrats, you can toggle that and search only for those bills. And finally, we enable users to search by trifecta status. So if you're interested only in bills that have been introduced or acted on in states with Republican or Democratic trifectas, you can search accordingly.
Yeah, and this is a really fun area with context, right? Because everyone, might read about the one bill here or the one bill there that they hear about either on, TV coverage or on, radio shows or on blogs or wherever else they're digesting their political news of the day. But how does that one or two pieces of legislation fit into the context of all of the activity that goes on in state governments? Well, that's the really exciting part because there's a lot of legislation in this area.
Right. And so when readers go through the whole search process, what information are we going to present to them when they run that search?
So when readers run a search for any given bill, immediately they'll see the state, the bill number, the official name of the bill, the most recent action taken on the bill, its legislative status, and the topics that the bill deals with. Readers can also search into an individual bill and open up a specific page that deals with that bill. And that will include more information about most recent actions, about trifecta status, about partisan sponsorship, and it will also include a link to the full text of the bill.
That's a lot of information. And I was looking at the database earlier and was kind of blown away by the number of bills we are tracking, over 2,500. Where are we getting all this information from?
We get our information from Bill Track 50, which is a service that aggregates legislative data from the 50 states, the individual legislative websites, and then presents that information in a standardized format. We then take that information that we get from Bill Track 50 and analyze it. Most notably, we go through and review the legislative status of each bill and determine at what point it is in the legislative process. Obviously, we also go through and we review the contents of the bill and apply tags to describe the topic of the bill.
And how often are these entries being updated?
We update our information on a daily basis. Every day, as we become aware of new developments, either new bills being introduced or actions being taken on existing bills, we update our database accordingly, and those updates are reflected basically in real time immediately to the tracker database.
Yeah, our friends at Bill Track 50, they're the best. They're great to work with, and we have such a fun time, working with the raw data that we take in and adding those tags and putting together, neutral, clear bill summaries and then getting the visuals and the weekly report together at the end of each week. It's just a really fun way for us to follow along with the legislation and make it easy for journalists, for readers, and for activists to understand the landscape.
You mentioned a weekly digest. Could you describe that more for our listeners?
Yeah, Jarek, that's your brainchild. So tell us about how all that works.
It's really been an opportunity for me to nerd out in this subject area. So what I do each week is I review all of the actions taken on bills during the course of that week, whether new bills were introduced or existing bills saw some action, for instance, a committee hearing, passage in one part of the legislature, so on and so forth. I compile information about those bills, and then we put it into a written report that includes specific information on bills that have been enacted or passed by both chambers of the legislature. We also include overarching data about the total number of bills that have been introduced year to date and bills that have been acted on just within the past week. We correlate all of that information with partisan sponsorship information and state trifecta status, so you can get a sense of where the parties stand with respect to legislation. I think it's one of the more interesting things that we're doing.
Yeah, not everyone wants to nerd out like he and I do every day and live in the database and have a lot of fun with it. So that's why we love the weekly report feature, because it delivers straight into your inbox a really easy to understand summary that might tell you, well, 4 bills were enacted this week, and here are those 4 bills, and here's what those bills do and what they say. We understand that not everybody wants this information on a daily basis. So the weekly digest is a way to reach a lot more readers who may not want to spend every day in here. And, there's a lot more exciting things in the world to entertain yourself with than digging through thousands of legislation bills.
Are you telling me most people aren't obsessed with politics like we are?
What? Who would say that?
How would our readers sign up for this? What is that website? I don't think we've mentioned it.
Yeah, you just go to legislation.ballotpedia.org, and then there's an email sign-up box on a couple of different places on the site that you just pop your email in. We don't sell your email. We're not going to do anything with it. And you'll just get a nice, wonderful summary report from Jarek every Friday.
Something I found really intuitive about the database was the status symbols that we use to mark where a piece of legislation is in the process. Jarek, do you want to kind of talk our listeners through why we went about standardizing all of these?
Sure. One of the main difficulties involved in tracking state level legislation is that the state legislatures themselves aren't always extremely clear about where a bill stands in the legislative process. A lot of very special parliamentary language is used to describe bill status. And for a lot of readers, this can be really counterintuitive and somewhat confusing. For instance, a phrase like placed on the consent calendar doesn't necessarily have much meaning to the average person. So what we've done is we've gone through and sort of taken that aspect out of it so that users don't have to do that extra bit of legwork to figure out what the status applied by the legislature actually means. We can review it and say, okay, well, based on other actions that have happened up to this point, we can say that this bill has passed one of the chambers in the legislature and it's being considered in the other chamber. That enables users to understand more readily what's going on with a specific bill, and it facilitates comparisons across states and across bills.
Yeah, that's great. As someone who's immersed in this, I still get confused by some of these state legislature websites. And then finally, do we have any bigger plans for the legislator tracker? Are there other topics that we're hoping to aggregate?
Yeah, there's tens of thousands of bills introduced in state legislatures every single year. And the election legislation space is really just actually a small part of that. So, as much as we have a great deal of fun playing around with the election legislation space, we look forward to expanding to other areas of legislation tracking in the future. So stay tuned, listeners.
Our listeners can find all this information at legislation.ballotpedia.org. Thank you both for being on the show today. June 28th was one of the busiest primary nights of the year, with elections held in 8 states. Here to discuss the results is staff writer Doug Kreneisel. Hi, Doug.
Hi, Victoria. Thanks for having me.
Let's start in Illinois, where we've been watching the rare instance of several incumbents running against each other. How did those races play out?
It's typically rare to see incumbents running against each other in primaries, but less so in the election cycle following redistricting. States are going around redrawing lines based on population changes over the past decade, and sometimes those lines can draw 2 incumbents into the same district. In Illinois, in particular, the state actually lost a congressional district, so all of a sudden they had 18 House incumbents, but only 17 House districts, which doesn't really add up. With all this said, we knew before the first ballot was cast that at least 2 House incumbents were guaranteed to lose because there were 2 sets of primaries where 2 incumbents filed to run against each other. In the 6th district, which is located in the Chicago area, you had a Democratic primary between Sean Casten and Marie Newman. And both of those incumbents are relatively new to the House. Casten defeated a Republican incumbent in 2018, and Newman actually won in 2020 after she beat another Democratic incumbent in that year's primary. In the 15th district, which is downstate from Chicago, you had a Republican primary between Rodney Davis and Mary Miller. There were some dueling endorsements in this race. Former President Donald Trump endorsed Miller, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce endorsed Davis.
Who ended up winning in those races?
Casten won the Democratic primary with around 68% of the vote, and Miller defeated Davis with 58% of the vote.
Have we had any other incumbent versus incumbent races in this primary season?
These are the 3rd and 4th that we've tracked so far this primary season. There have been 2 others so far, a Republican primary in West Virginia, where the state also lost a seat after redistricting. In that race, David McKinley was defeated. And then down in Georgia, there was another incumbent versus incumbent primary between 2 Democrats, Lucy McBath and Carolyn Bordeaux, in a district sort of in the Atlanta suburbs. And in that one, Carolyn Bordeaux was defeated.
Illinois also cast votes in their gubernatorial primary on June 28th, which was shaking out to be one of the most expensive races in state history. How much money was spent on all sides?
Actually, Illinois is really trying to corner the market on expensive gubernatorial elections, both in 2018 and now in 2022. But this actually is the most expensive race in state history. According to the Illinois State Board of Elections, more than $216 million has been spent among the 8 candidates who are in the running. That includes incumbent Governor J.B. Pritzker, who won his primary and will be in the general election, and 6 Republicans who were running in their party's primary. And there were a couple of big spenders in the race. Businessman Richard Wieline gave $9 million to State Senator Darren Bailey, and then hedge fund manager Ken Griffin gave $50 million to Aurora Mayor, and Aurora is the 2nd largest city in Illinois, Richard Irvin.
And so did all of that money make a difference in the Republican primary?
Well, as we said, Irvin received a bunch of money, but actually placed 3rd. Bailey ended up winning. He also had Donald Trump's endorsement. He received 57% of the vote.
Let's move our attention to Colorado, where several Republican primaries have our attention, including for Secretary of State, the U.S. Senate, and the newly created 8th District. Let's just hone in on a few races, in particular, the Republican primary for Secretary of State. Can you tell us a little bit about the context of that race?
Yeah, this was a very enjoyable race to follow, or rather exciting to keep an eye on. You've had different candidates, including in their platforms, planks about what they would change with how elections are run or managed. But in these secretaries of state races, it actually takes on an added level of importance because secretaries of state are the people who run the elections. So the Democrats didn't have a primary here in Colorado. Incumbent Jenna Griswold will advance to the general election, but Republicans had a decision to make. We had Pam Anderson, Mike O'Donnell, and Tina Peters running for that nomination. And a lot of the conversation leading up to the primary centered on Anderson and Peters, both of whom had experience serving as county clerks, which are sort of like county level secretaries of state. And one of the big issues that played a role in this race were allegations of fraud in the 2020 election. Anderson campaigned that that election happened legitimately, and she received endorsements from a handful of former Republican secretaries of state. Peters, on the other hand, raised doubts about the 2020 election and actually is currently under indictment over an election tampering investigation following the unauthorized release of confidential digital images and passwords associated with her county's election equipment. Ultimately, Anderson won the nomination with 44% of the vote, followed actually by O'Donnell, who works with nonprofits and business trends, with 29% of the vote, and then Peters had 27%.
And unlike Illinois, which lost a congressional seat, Colorado gained one with the 8th congressional district. How did that primary play out?
The primary was interesting. It was, there was a lot going on the Republican side, but it's really the general election that's going to be one that we're keeping a really close eye on this cycle. So in the 8th district, again, Democrats had no primary. Yadira Caraveo, a member of the state House, will be their nominee. State Senator Barbara Kirkmeyer ended up securing the Republican nomination with around 41% of the vote, beating 3 other challengers. And the reason this district is going to be so interesting to watch is because it was made to be super competitive when it was created. So if you kind of have an idea of what Colorado looks like, it's a big square. In the top right corner, not all the way up, but in that general vicinity, that's where the 8th district is. It's just north of Denver, along the interstate there, stretching up towards the Boulder, Fort Collins area. Greeley is the really big town in the area. And it's really kind of 50-50 as far as partisan makeup goes. And additionally, there's around 30 to 35% of the voters in the district are Latino. So there's a lot at play that I'm sure a lot of people will watch for and then have a lot of opinions about after the general election in the 8th district of Colorado this year.
Moving over to New York, Democratic Governor Kathy Hochul is seeking a full term in New York's Democratic gubernatorial primary. Hochul, who was formerly the state's lieutenant governor, assumed office in 2021 following the resignation of former Governor Andrew Cuomo. How did her primary play out?
Not too many fireworks, really. Hochul secured the Democratic nomination with 67% of the vote. But the really interesting thing here was kind of where the 3 candidates placed themselves ideologically. You had Hochul, the incumbent, who in a primary is the one you're trying to beat. But then you had U.S. Representative Tom Suozzi, who criticized Hochul for, quote, pandering to the far left, end quote. And then you also had Jermaine Williams, New York City's public advocate, who had endorsements from groups like Our Revolution, which occupies a space on the Democratic Party's left. Hochul, as we said, won. She'll be running against U.S. House Representative from the 1st District, Lee Zeldin, who won the Republican primary.
We were also following 2 Republican primary runoffs in Mississippi featuring incumbents. The state held its primaries on June 7th, but since no candidates received over 50% of the vote, the contest advanced to a runoff in the 3rd district between Representative Michael Guest and Michael Cassidy, and the 4th district between Representative Stephen Palazzo and Mike Ezell. What were the results there?
In the 3rd congressional district, we actually ended up seeing kind of the vote totals turn. So in the primary, the incumbent Guest trailed Cassidy by 1 percentage point, but with the runoff election results coming in, Guest had received 66% of the vote, and we'll be heading to the general election there. As for the 4th district, we had another incumbent defeat, the 3rd of the night after those 2 in Illinois, and the 9th overall for the U.S. House. Incumbent Palazzo lost to Ezell, who's the Jackson County sheriff. Palazzo had been facing some allegations of ethics violations over misused campaign funds. He denied those allegations, but what effect that had on the primary and then eventually on the runoff, I'm sure people will be taking a closer look at.
And turning our attention to Oklahoma, the state's incumbent Attorney General John O'Connor, a Republican, faced his first electoral test after Governor Kevin Stitt appointed him to the position in 2021. Polling leading up to the primary showed O'Connor at 28% behind challenger Gretna Drummond, who was a 2018 candidate for the office. Can you tell our listeners what happened in that race?
Incumbent Attorney General John O'Connor was unable to fend off the primary challenge from Drummond. There's a really tight margin of victory for Drummond, who received nearly 51% of the vote, roughly 6,000 more than O'Connor, who had 49%. And so now Drummond will advance to the general election, where there are no Democrats running, but there's a Libertarian candidate, Linda Steele.
Also in Oklahoma, we were following 10 candidates who were running in the Republican primary for the special U.S. Senate election. The special election is to fill the rest of the 6-year term left by Senator Jim Inhofe, who was last elected in 2020. Inhofe announced he would resign January 3rd, 2023 to spend time with his family. Lots of storylines in the crowded field. Doug, who did voters favor at the polls?
Yeah, well, they certainly had plenty of candidates to choose from, but ended up favoring the U.S. House Representative from the state's 2nd District, Markwayne Mullin, with 44% of the vote. But Oklahoma also uses runoff rules where, you've got to get over 50% of the vote to go straight to the general election. And since Mullin did not do that, there will be a runoff on August 23rd between Mullin and the second place finisher, T.W. Shannon, who received 18% of the vote in this special primary.
And then the last race we're going to talk about is the GOP runoff for South Carolina's Superintendent of Education, which occurred because the incumbent Molly Spearman decided not to run for re-election. Can you tell us how that played out?
So this was a really interesting race, not really one directly on our radar, but this was a runoff between Ellen Weaver, who's the president of a conservative think tank called the Palmetto Promise Institute, and Kathy Manis, who's the executive director of the Palmetto State Teachers Association. And so the superintendent of education is kind of like the executive director of the state's education department. The incumbent, like you said, Molly Spearman, did not seek re-election, but actually endorsed Manis in this race. But Weaver campaigned against Manis, likening her to Democratic politicians like Vice President Kamala Harris and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Manis shot down these comparisons, but Weaver ultimately received over 60% of the vote and won the runoff. Will advance to the general election, where she'll face Lisa Ellis, a teacher and a Democrat from Richland.
Well, that's it for our election results update. Our listeners can subscribe to our newsletter, Heart of the Primaries, to stay up to date on the latest primary news. Thanks for coming on to break down the results, Doug.
Hey everyone, Jeff Pallay, Ballotpedia's editor-in-chief. Here at Ballotpedia, our mission is to ensure that every citizen has access to information to make informed decisions about their vote in every election. If this is a dream you share, well, you're in luck. Ballotpedia is hiring and looking to add to our team of fast learners and creative problem solvers who are eager to work hard to make the world a better place. To learn more about our current openings, you can find them at ballotpedia.org/jobs or via the link in our show notes.
On June 28th, the Supreme Court stayed a federal district court ruling in Louisiana that struck down the congressional district boundaries enacted earlier in the year on March 30th, when the Republican state legislature overrode Democratic Governor John Bel Edwards' veto of legislation establishing the new districts. Here to discuss this and other redistricting updates across the country is Marquee staff writer Dave Bowden. Welcome to On the Ballot, Dave.
Thanks for having me, Victoria.
So, how did SCOTUS handle this case?
So it's been a busy month related to redistricting in Louisiana. So the decision that came out from the Supreme Court was 6-3. It was an anonymous decision by the court, but Justices Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan all dissented. But let's take a step back a little bit and look at just the timeline of what has happened. On June 6th, so earlier this month, the federal district court struck down the boundaries that Louisiana had enacted on March 30th. And that district court ruling enjoined the state, meaning they prevented it from using those districts in the 2022 elections. The members of the state legislature and some state executive officers in Louisiana appealed to the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. And on June 9th, they issued an administrative stay of the district court ruling. But then on June 12th, the same court vacated that stay and basically denied the motions to stay the ruling and allowed the federal district court proceedings to continue. So then on June 15th, Governor Edwards called a special session for the legislature to come up with new maps. The session ended without them coming up with maps on the 18th. But on June 17th, you had the Secretary of State, Kyle Ardoin, and the Attorney General, Jeff Landry, and they asked SCOTUS to stay the federal district court's ruling. And that's exactly what they did.
What happens next?
The other court proceedings may or may not continue. There were actually 2 active proceedings that were going on in Louisiana. In the federal district court case, there was supposed to be an evidentiary hearing this morning that was going to review the proposed redistricting plans. I haven't had a chance to check in and see whether or not that took place, but that was part of the process of the district court trying to come up with new maps because the legislature did not. And then the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals was supposed to have oral argument on the case, which was on the appeal. That was supposed to take place on July 8th. And again, I'm not entirely sure if that's going to happen.
Yeah, it's a lot to follow. SCOTUS granted certiorari in the case. Can you explain what that fancy word means to our listeners?
What that means is just that it will hear the case and it's going to put it on its docket. It indicated that it was inclined to combine this case, or at least include it on the docket, with a similar case that happened in Alabama, which was earlier this cycle. And the name of that case is Milligan v. Merrill. In that case, the legislature had issued redistricting plans. A federal court panel issued a preliminary injunction against them, saying that they were likely to prevail because Black voters were not appropriately represented on the congressional redistricting plan. So it's a very similar, very analogous case, and it actually centers on a lot of the same issues as to whether or not the Voting Rights Act requires that a certain number of districts be designed so that Black voters would have a higher likelihood of electing candidates of their choice. Now, what was interesting in the Supreme Court case in the Alabama decision was that decision was 5-4. And in that case, Judge Roberts joined Justice Kagan, Justice Breyer, and Justice Sotomayor in the dissent. And the Supreme Court has indicated that it is very likely to hear the Merrill case in its upcoming term in 2022, 2023, but it has not specifically scheduled it yet.
So after this Supreme Court ruling, we now know all the district boundaries used for the 2022 elections. However, one state, Montana, didn't complete legislative redistricting this cycle. Can you let our listeners know how that happened?
Yeah, this was really an interesting situation brought about by the delays that resulted from the release of the census data. So according to the Constitution in Montana, the state constitution, the Redistricting Commission submits their proposed legislative maps to the legislature so that the legislature can provide some recommendations about those maps before they're enacted. And in 2021, the legislature adjourned on April 29th, and U.S. Census did not deliver the data to the states until August of that year. So it was much after that the legislature had adjourned. In Montana, as is the case in several states around the nation, the legislature only meets in odd-numbered years. So the next session is going to take place in 2023.
It's interesting that they didn't call a special session for redistricting. I wonder what the rules are regarding that. So this year's legislative elections in Montana will take place using the maps from 2010, correct?
Exactly.
I also heard that several states are using maps for this election only, including New York, which held primaries on June 28th for statewide offices and state assembly districts.
Yeah, this is an interesting situation. So we have several states that are going to be using maps that are only in effect for this one cycle, for the 2022 cycle. And then they're going to be using different maps that the legislature or whoever the redistricting bodies are going to develop after this. So New York was a very interesting case. An appellate division of the New York Supreme Court ruled that the assembly boundaries that were adopted in February were invalid, but that they should still be used for the 2022 legislative elections. So consequently, these boundaries were used in the primaries, but they are only going to be used for this current series of elections. There will be a different map in place for the 2024 elections.
Now, looking down south in South Carolina, Governor Henry McMaster's actually just signed new state house districts on June 24th. Why was that necessary?
It's a really interesting situation, and it is kind of similar, but this is as a result of a lawsuit. So a federal group of civil rights organizations filed a federal lawsuit late last year that challenged the maps used for the South Carolina House of Representatives, alleging that there was racial gerrymandering related to several counties and a handful of districts. And as a result of the settlement of that lawsuit, the South Carolina legislature agreed that they would create new maps and that those maps would be used going forward from the 2024 cycle and beyond. What was interesting is that South Carolina has already held its primaries. Its election cycle for 2022 is fully underway. And so those set of maps that were passed previously will just be used for this current cycle. And the South Carolina legislature just went ahead and adopted the new maps that are going to be used for 2024. So they passed a series of maps just last week that are going to take effect for 2024, even though the elections in 2022 will take place using the maps that they've already adopted.
It'll be interesting to see how these temporary maps affect election results from this cycle to the next. The last two here that are also using temporary maps are Ohio and North Carolina.
So in Ohio's case, there's been a lot of court activity related to the maps, both at the congressional and the legislative level there. And in fact, both sets of maps are the subject of ongoing legal proceedings at both the state and federal level. And a lot of those haven't been resolved yet. So this situation is still pretty fluid. But specifically as it relates to the legislative maps, there was a federal district court ruling that took effect on May 28th. It was made on May 27th. And it basically said that the state of Ohio needed to use a remedial legislative map for this year's elections, the 2022, because there was no map that existed that had received the approval of both the state's Redistricting Commission and also the state Supreme Court. Essentially, what they said is, you just don't have enough time. We need to conduct elections. And so that's what they did. They ruled that there was one of the proposals was going to have to be good enough that they ruled that the state legislative primaries would take place using that map on August 2nd. But they made the specification that it would only be used for this year's elections only. And therefore, they would have to adopt new legislative maps in 2024. Now, making this even more complicated is the fact that because the maps on the congressional side and also the legislative side were passed without enough support from the minority party under Ohio's redistricting process, those maps are only going to be good for 4 years anyway. So they would have to redraw them, especially the congressional maps and also the legislative maps, before the 2026 elections, because according to the provisions of their constitutional amendments that talk about redistricting, if it doesn't get enough support from members of the minority party, it's only good for partway through the cycle. So Ohio is going to be a state that's going to have tons of redistricting information and tons of redistricting activity for pretty much the rest of the decade, I predict. In North Carolina, again, you had a similar situation as you have with most of these other states. So you had a county superior court that issued a ruling that rejected a map that the legislature had redrawn. This was for their congressional districts, and it imposed an interim set of congressional district boundaries and basically said this map can only be used for this year's elections. It's a remedial map, and therefore you will have to draw a new one before the 2024 cycle. So we have a situation now where we have 5 or 6 states that are using a series of maps that are just for these 2022 elections. They're not going to be used after this. And I did kind of a quick look and did not really see that this situation happened after the 2010 census. So it really is a unique situation, a unique set of circumstances that we're having because of the census delays and a whole bunch of other things. But it's going to make the redistricting process, although it is over for the 2022 cycle, it's going to keep going.
Well, thank you for making sense of this redistricting news. It's a lot to keep up with. And thanks for coming on the show.
Hello there, dear listeners, and welcome to the first trivia segment of On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, which will be talking about historical ballot measures. I'm Paul Rader, and if you're listening to this, you're great. And if you're not listening to this, well, you can't hear me, but start listening to the podcast. Now, each week at the beginning of this segment, we're going to pose a question to all of you that is relevant to the trivia topic at hand. And then at the end of this segment, we'll give you the answer. But first, here's a quick background on the question. Now, each state has its own laws regarding how each political party can appear on the ballot. The Republican and Democratic parties appear in all 50 states, but third parties can only appear on the ballot in certain states, but not in others. So the first ever On the Ballot with Ballotpedia trivia question I pose to you is this. As of December 2021, how many states have ballot-qualified political parties that are neither Republican nor Democrat? I'll have the answer for you later on the show. Now, today's trivia on ballot measures concerns ballot access. It's one thing to be up for a vote, but it's a whole other story to get to that point in the first place. And the content of the ballot measures involving how other ballot measures, candidates, and political parties get on an election ballot varies just as much as each state's current ballot access laws. And such ballot access measures have been coming up for a vote for a long, long time. How long ago was it, Paul? Well, it was well before any of us were born. Or so I assume, unless you're the 2,000-year-old man. Take October 1911, for instance. During the bygone days of the William H. Taft presidency, California's Proposition 7 sought to give California voters the ability to place initiatives and referendums on the ballot themselves. 76.41% of said voters approved this amendment, making the Golden State the 10th state to authorize its voters to initiate legislation through direct democracy. Now, of course, we've also had more recent ballot access related measures as well. In 2020, 50.55% of Alaska voters approved Alaska Ballot Measure 2, which was the top 4 ranked choice voting and campaign finance laws initiative, and Ballot Measure 2 replaced Alaska's partisan primaries with the country's first top 4 primary for state executive, state legislative, and congressional elections, along with a ranked choice voting system for the general election. In fact, we just saw this top 4 primary system employed for the first time on June 11th, 2022, in the special election to replace the late longtime U.S. House Representative Don Young. Now, as was said earlier, the content of these ballot measures can differ considerably. So, I've got a few other examples for you at various points in time, some of which were passed by voters and others which were defeated. In my home state of Florida, back in 1998, the Commission referred Ballot Measure Amendment 11, titled Ballot Access, Public Campaign Financing, and Election Process Revisions, was approved with 64.1% of the vote. Among its provisions was the stipulation that ballot access requirements for independent and minor party candidates cannot be greater than requirements for majority party candidates. And in 2016, in South Dakota, the citizen-initiated constitutional measure Nonpartisan Elections Constitutional Amendment 5 was defeated, with 55.49% of voters voting no. The measure would have provided for the state constitution to establish nonpartisan elections, hence the name. And finally, in Maine in 1951, the legislatively referred measure Direct Initiative Signature Requirements Proposed Constitutional Amendment Number 2 was approved with 51.77% of the vote, changing the signature requirements for direct initiatives to 10% of the total votes for governor cast in the most recent gubernatorial election. And now, let's end the suspense and answer that question I posed to you earlier in this segment. Again, that question is, as of December 2021, how many states have ballot-qualified political parties that are neither Republican nor Democrat? And if your answer is 36, you win! You have my admiration and you should treat yourself. Go out to dinner and have someone else pick up the tab or something. If you want to further interact with the podcast trivia, you can send us questions of your own at editor@ballotpedia.org. and they may get answered on the show. That does it for our first ever trivia segment. Thanks for listening, and it's time to send this back to our host. Take it away, Victoria.
That's all for this week's episode of On the Ballot. Thanks again to Jeff, Jarek, Doug, Dave, and Paul for coming on the show. Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be back next week. If you have any questions, comments, or just left for BP, feel free to send it to us at ontheballot@ballotpedia.org or on Twitter @Ballotpedia. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for listening.